fun. But let's get into some stats because there's actually some all-time high information floating around in here. So again, one thing that we like to do on the show is like calculate live stats. So if you're like, oh, that's cool, calculate that for Coinbase or something, then feel free to shout those tickers out and we'll try to take a look at them while we have time. But speaking of rallies, what the Q's at, it's up 47% on the year. It's very, not a ton of growth in the past month or the past week, but just overall really bullish year when we look back to February of 2023. So this, of all of the market indices, has had the strongest performance. Although the the S&P 500 is kind of catching up. And now we have the Qs. Really big overnight move last night, presumably as a result of these Nvidia earnings. It rallied 2% overnight. So from yesterday's close to today's open, really big overnight move. And when you look at the probability of a reversal, so like the probability that we open higher than 2%, which we did, it's about 2% of cases. So we're in a really small number of occurrences. We're in about 2% of occurrences, and the probability of a reversal, as in given that we open up this much, what's the probability that we're ultimately going to close down? So looking at today's close relative to yesterday's close is about 14%, 13.5%, something like that. So there's not a very strong possibility of us reversing after a big move like this today. So for me, kind of tempted to maybe do like a 0 DTE kind of situation, maybe a 1 DTE kind of situation, because for the most part, the Qs are pretty set in their ways, but there's still, a good chance, like, above a 10% chance that we're actually going to reverse. Buys actually really, just pass all-time highs again for the 9th time in the last month, actually. So really good number of times in the last month was the S&P surpassing all-time highs. So usually, we're used to a lot of this upside movement in the Qs, but now we're kind of starting to see it in the S&P 500, where the Russell is very much lagging behind. The S&P also had a very big move last night. So it was 1.3, almost 1.4% to the upside from yesterday's close to today's open. So the probability of that reversal is even lower than with the Qs. So we're in about 2.5% of occurrences. Very rare to be in these sort of, very strong opens, I guess, for some of these market indices. And the probability of a reversal is between like 7 and 8%. It's closer to 8%. So the S&P 500 is pretty much set. If we do have a reversal, it's going to be quite rare, which could maybe make an argument for a directional play. That's kind of why I'm considering it. But, maybe we should be responsible. Who knows? The market doesn't seem very responsible. And then the Russell is very much lagging behind the other two indices, or the other two that we tend to look at. It hasn't hit all-time highs since 2021, and it has been pretty much sideways for the past year, actually. So we are officially up on the year. We're up about 5%, down a little bit in the past week, up a little bit in the past month. But for the most part, we've had a pretty sideways year, actually, for the Russell, where, the Qs are up nearly 47%. The Russell's only up 5%. And you can see that it's kind of really been fluctuating around this 190, around its starting price, actually, throughout the year. So that's kind of why it's been my friend lately. Hopefully we stay on good speaking terms, because some of this like uphill trajectory that we saw falling up the stairs a little bit was not terribly pleasant for me, but for the most part in the long term, it's been pretty sideways, actually. We also have natural gas, which had a kind of surprising 12% rally yesterday, and then continuing with these four, these sell-offs that we're seeing in natural gas. So natural gas is selling off pretty significantly over the past couple of weeks. It's down about 30% on the year, and a lot of that came from really this really steep sell-off from the last couple of weeks. So natural gas is really bad news bears not having a great time. What's having a great time is everything semiconductor, everything chip, everything sucked. When I ran this, it was 666, which is the 3.5 standard deviation move, which is about how I'm feeling right now. Yeah.
Is that a lucky number?
So, that's one way to put it. It's the devil's number, so maybe that's like, but yeah, no, SMH up 666% as of when I put the slide together, which was about maybe an hour ago. It's 3.5 sigma move because we're in hell. It's surpassed all-time highs 6 times in the last month. So not quite as strong or not quite as frequent as like the S&P 500, but still like really significant amount of growth. SMH is up 73% on the year. And you can see that really big move from the last couple of weeks, which is great, or the last couple of days, to be honest, and really dramatically outperforming even like the NASDAQ, which is pretty surprising. So for an ETF, this amount of growth is pretty nuts. And yeah, we are seeing a 2 sigma move today. It might have even gone higher, to be totally honest. And when we see these really big moves, so the probability of a 2 sigma move in SMH is about 5%, at least looking at historical data. And the probability of having another one in the next 2 weeks is about 67%. So there's actually a very high probability that we're going to have another very big move. Although this doesn't look at upside versus downside, we just know that there's a very high probability of another big move. Although keeping in mind that a large part of this move may have come from Nvidia's earnings and sort of the binary event around that. So just to kind of keep that caveat in mind while trading this, although I don't really want to. But for ETFs, because they're a bit more diversified, generally these probabilities tend to be a bit higher. The SMH happens to have a very large exposure to Nvidia. I think it's like 23% or something like that. So to just take that with a grain of salt and maybe prepare for some upcoming volatility, even though it is like we just have to keep in mind that this was likely because of a binary event. And we also don't know the direction. So we have Nvidia, which is up 15% as of when I put the slide together, which is a 5 sigma move, which is great. Kind of not what I was expecting, to be honest. And it surpassed all-time highs 12 times in the last 22 days. So this was certainly a significant move, but not out of place, given how it's performed in the last month, where more than half of the days, it was surpassing all-time highs. In the last year, we're now up 228%. And because it does make up, I think we can double check. I might check the last, let's check it again and see if there's any updates. It makes up, 3.7% of the S&P 500 is Nvidia. So that's part of like a really big reason why we're seeing such a crazy market rally today, which sucks. But it is really one company can have a pretty significant impact on a market index, despite the fact that it does represent the whole market. But even just because of how crazy this rally has been, it's had pretty profound effects on the S&P and on the NASDAQ. So we're not going to underestimate upside risk this year. That's the New Year's resolution. We're not going to underestimate upside risk. But really significant amount of growth. In the past month, we're up 30%. This move of being up 15% in a day, honestly, in the grand scheme, it's almost like hard to see. So I don't know. I feel like this is unsustainable levels of growth. Definitely not as bad as SMCI. That's on another level. But when it comes to how I feel about the long-term prospects of Nvidia, we can maybe like have a broader discussion around analyst price targets and sort of general sentiment around the sector. I did do a study. I don't remember the last time I did it, maybe like 2 weeks ago, and maybe we revisited it recently. But basically, like if Nvidia was not in the S&P 500, then the S&P would have returned maybe like 15% on the year instead of 20. But that difference would have been even more dramatic with the NASDAQ. It's going to be difficult to backtest because I have to recalculate the weights. Whereas like, so it's an approximation, whatever. But dude, I don't know. Yeah, it'd be even more dramatic with the NASDAQ. No wonder it's up 47% on the year. Crazy. So I'm going to be watching this, going to continue to be watching this, not going to, I don't know. Is it time to trade directionally, Luis?
I think it's getting closer.
It's getting closer. I'm pretty close, especially on days like today, where you have just a really big overnight move. Like the Qs rallied 2% last night. Really big move for today, or at least for that overnight move. Not necessarily on the day, but still it was a big move. SPY rallied 1.4%. It opened up really significantly. A move of 1.3, 1.4 in the S&P 500 is not that crazy in a day, but for overnight movement, that's pretty significant. So if there was any day, I don't know, I will consider it. But in terms of trading directionally, I'm kind of getting a little bit closer to that point, especially on days like today where you have these very big outlier overnight moves. But that's just me. I don't know. We'll hop back into markets in a minute. And then SMCI. So you have SMCI. You're welcome to try to make sense of this. It's really just sector wide. So much money flowing into the entire sector at this point. So after selling off 1999, that's a great number. After selling off nearly 20%, and then selling off a little bit over the subsequent days, rallied again up 21%, and it might actually even be higher if it's moved since I put this slide together. So it's surpassed all-time highs 15 times in the last 22 days. And we are also on our 8th consecutive up week for SMCI. The longest recorded up streak was 9 weeks. So this has happened 2 times since 2015 when we're measuring this. This has happened 2 other times, this number of consecutive streaks. The longest up streak is 9 weeks. So if we have another up week next week, we're actually going to be at a record. And then if we have another one after that, we're going to be breaking a record. We're just breaking records up in here, which is great. And SMCI, we're not quite at the all-time highs that we hit a couple days ago. But we are still up 850% on the year.